Welcome back to the second day of the conference, and today we will have four sessions. The first session focuses on motion and posture in Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. Sessions 2 and 3 will explore how various languages of the ancient Near East and the context, for example Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, South Arabic, and Elamite, and how various biblical languages such as Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Targumic Aramaic express motion and posture or reproduce Hebrew motion and posture in their respective translations. The final session this afternoon will provide some examples taken from the Old and the New Testament. The first speaker of today is Lucie Perez. She is a French doctoral candidate from the University of Copenhagen. Her expertise is in statistics applied to linguistics, and in particular to Biblical and Qumran Hebrew. She's working on a project concerning the quantitative approach to motion verbs complements in Masoretic and Qumran Hebrew. Her contribution today is entitled Going Up to Jerusalem, Linguistic Variation in the Light of Motion Verb Complements in Manuscripts of Isaiah. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well first? Yes? Okay. No, not that much. I will try to speak up and just wave if there's an issue, of course. So first, thank you very much, Paola, for the introduction and for the invitation. And I will start right away with my presentation. So what am I going to talk about today? So first, I will briefly introduce the general topic of motion verb complements in order just to situate my paper in the current academic context on motion verbs in ancient Hebrew. Afterwards, I will present the result of my investigation in three sections. A general section, first, on complement construction in the three manuscripts that I studied. A second section, where I will present the variations observed between the sources when it comes to the construction of complements. And in the third section, I will focus on variations in prepositional complements. I will conclude briefly with some thoughts on textual fluidity. Complements, they can come sometimes with a directive hey, and two types of non-prepositional complements, either as a simple verbal complement, which is a complement without marking, that is so the factors that influence the choice of a specific complement type has been a topic in academia for decades. There are two major comprehensive studies of these complements in the Masoretic text. And the first one was conducted in the 1960s by Herman Auster, and the more recent one was published in 2020 in a PhD thesis from Catherine Medill in the US. So Auster focused on the complements of motion verbs, while Medill investigated the markings of goals, but very often with the motion verb. And while these studies have different theoretical frameworks, they drew major conclusions on the use of complements with motion verbs. So first, from a linguistic perspective, the nature of the complement is an important factor for the chosen construction. For instance, non-prepositional complements are generally associated with place names and correspond to a general movement to a place, while prepositions usually, but not always, have a more specific meaning. Medill also finds that non-prepositional complements are strongly correlated with prototypical motion constructions, which is when an agent is willingly moving towards a goal. And prepositional complements also appear in contexts where other types are restricted, for instance, by morphological factors, to which the directive hey, for instance, is very sensitive. The linguistic environment of a complement is also an important factor on its construction. Okay. Medill shows, for instance, the effect of priming on the choice of markings. So that means when in a clause or a preceding clause, a specific construction is used, then the same construction is much more likely to be used if another complement appears. This is a cognitive mechanism that when we use something in a sentence, then we are more likely to use it again in a similar construction. And then maybe from a perspective that is closer to biblical studies, Austell and Medill agree that early and late biblical Hebrew show different patterns in complement markings. Austell shows that the verbal complement, so this is a complement that comes without any markings, decreases in use in Ezra, Nehemiah, and in Chronicles. So in these late books, the verbal complement occurs only 44% of the time with simple place names, whereas in the rest of the Hebrew Bible altogether, it occurs 94% of the time in a similar context. So there is a clear decrease in the use of verbal complement.
Can you hear me? Closer? Okay. So finally, Medill concludes on the variety of marking used. She actually asks the question, why did scribes use such a variety of complement constructions? And she explains that the use of different goal marking strategies was first part of the scribal education, and that the ability to use these strategies was considered a demonstration of competence and skill, while at the same time, these practices emphasized the importance and the prestige of the text that the scribes were writing. But the studies that I've mentioned so far have not taken into account the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls. While scholars do not always disregard this text, they often disagree on how to assess textual fluidity in the sources, and when they find fluidity, they disagree on what to do with the variations. So before diving deeper into the evidence from the manuscripts of Isaiah, I thought it was interesting to compare the results of two investigations of variation between the Masoretic text and the DSS. So first, Robert Redzetko and Jan Young compared, and here I quote them, the frequency of the directive hey relative to all the variants of the variable to come to X place. So they focused on the verb bo, only in the cal stem, and they investigated 750 occurrences from the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they found that the sources disagree 44% of the time, so almost half of the time, on the use of the directive hey, and that even within the Dead Sea Scrolls, scrolls disagree sometimes with each other. So that's one number. But on the other hand, in her PhD thesis, Catherine Medill conducted one case study on textual fluidity in goal markings between MT Samuel and 4Q Samuel A. And she found that these two sources disagree only 12% of the time when it comes to the marking of goals. And that she never finds a syntactic change. So that means she never finds a change from a prepositional complement to a non-prepositional complement or vice versa. So of course, and as always, it is not easy to compare the results of these two analyses because they have very different scope and focus. Nevertheless, both these studies show that, first, there is no clear consensus yet on the extent of textual fluidity between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this despite the very important amount of studies of the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course. And second, that still the Dead Sea Scrolls are not so easily dismissed by scholars when they investigate the Hebrew language. And this is what my PhD research project wants to address, among other questions. To what extent do the constructions of motion-verb complements vary between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls? So today is a first step, as I start with a case study of 3 sources of the book of Isaiah, so the Masoretic text, from the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the Great Scroll of Isaiah, 1Q Isaiah A, and the Lesser Scroll of Isaiah, 1Q Isaiah B, that I will call henceforth 1Q8. So, what do we have in these sources? First, a few numbers. In this table, you can see a simple count of the occurrences of motion verbs with a complement in each of the sources. MT Isaiah and 1Q Isaiah A have a very similar amount of complements, along with the motion verbs, with respectively 175 and 174 occurrences, which of course makes sense considering that 1Q Isaiah A is a very complete manuscript of the book of Isaiah. And we see that 1Q8, of course, is more fragmentary, with only 65 occurrences that were preserved. So as you can see, the prepositional complements are, by far, the most frequent constructions in 3 sources, while we have the occurrences of non-prepositional and prepositional complement that carry a directive hey that are very limited. Here is a representation that I think allows a quick and easy overview of the distribution of the complement constructions in the sources. So as you can see, each color represents the proportion of a complement construction, and each bar represents a source. So as we can see, there is only a slight difference in the frequency of each construction between the sources. So you can see in the middle bar, that 1Q Isaiah A has slightly more prepositional complements that you can see in blue, and also slightly more prepositional complements with a directive hey compared to the other sources. However, and here I must say we should always be careful with visualizations. The bar of 1Q8 can be misleading. I explain. I just said that the source is fragmentary, so the distribution that we observe here does not represent what the manuscript would have had, but it represents the distribution of constructions in the sections that have been preserved. So we can see that the 3 sources use each complement construction almost as regularly as the other sources, but this does actually not tell us much about the differences between the manuscripts. So let us first have a look at the variation of complement constructions. So actually, I could find only 3 cases where the sources disagree on complement constructions. And on that level, only the Masoretic text and 1Q Isaiah A disagree. So the first disagreement occur in Isaiah 10, verse 28, where 1Q Isaiah A seems to have a directive hey with ayat. And here I note, along with Donald Perry, that this could actually be just an orthographic variation. And it is very hard, of course, for us to know. But it could also be an addition of a directive hey. However, and for my purpose, I wanted to show it here, but I note that this is not per se a change in complement construction because the preposition is maintained, so we are facing a prepositional complement in both sources. The second and third disagreement, I believe, are quite interesting. In both cases, the Great Scroll has a prepositional complement, as you can see, while the Masoretic text does not. And this is interesting because it goes against what Medill found in the manuscripts of Samuel. And here I quote, she said, "While the precise morpheme used to mark the goal may vary, the syntax of the goal construction is stable." And earlier on the same page, she explains, there are no extant cases to which a prepositional strategy varies with a non-prepositional strategies. So this is interesting because that's exactly what we have here. So we can say that between these 3 sources, disagreement in the construction of motion verb complements are very rare. MT and 1Q8 actually never disagree, or at least on the preserved section. And they disagree, both these manuscripts, only approximately 2% of the time with 1Q Isaiah A. So this is, of course, very limited variation. However, as we just saw, this disagreement can mean a change in syntax, as we have in Isaiah 10, verse 29, and 60, verse 7, where a non-prepositional complement in the Masoretic text is actually a preposition one in 1Q Isaiah A. I'm almost done. The second and main source of variation in the complement of motion verb is found in the choice of prepositions. All disagreements, except for one, are found between the Masoretic text and 1Q Isaiah A, and they all consist of changes between the preposition el, al, or la. I will show them here, so maybe I don't have to spend too much time on them. So according to Edward Kutcher, this phenomenon can be explained by the weakenings of gutturals that we observed, of course, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Eric Raymond also mentions the variation between el and al, but he notes that they rarely entail a change in meaning. So above the 134 prepositional complements that MT and 1Q Isaiah A have in common, I found only 7 cases of disagreements, as you can see here. So that means that these manuscripts agree 95% of the time. So this is, again, a very limited amount of variation. And finally, there is only one disagreement that I found between MT and 1Q8. And this time, 1Q8 actually agrees with 1Q Isaiah A, which means that MT and 1Q8 agree 88% of the time. And I just wanted to mention that there are very few cases of prepositional complements with a directive hey, at least that I could find. And only one is a disagreement that I showed actually in my first slides. To conclude, the construction of motion verb complements in the 3 main Hebrew manuscripts of Isaiah are very stable. The sources agree 98% of the time, and actually up to 100% of the time for the Masoretic text and 1Q8, on the constructions of complements. And we observe slightly more variations within prepositional choices, but still without drastic changes in meaning. However, variation does not always occur within one type of construction. Actually, in a few cases, a non-prepositional complement to the Masoretic text becomes or is a prepositional complement in 1Q Isaiah A. Thus, while of course constructions are stable, they can still vary when it comes to syntax. And this is what I believe that one case study, like what I did today, and what Medill did also, is not enough if one wants to properly assess the syntactic variation of a given linguistic phenomenon between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is why, in my PhD research, I hope to do that. And I will shorten. Thank you very much for your attention.